The sky over Kaisel Vosh was the color of a fresh bruise, a swirling mixture of deep violets and sickly ochre. Rain did not fall on Ethelgard. Instead, a fine, shimmering mist of silicate dust descended from the upper atmosphere, coating the ruins in a layer of false diamonds. Vexen of the Iron Talon lay amid the jagged remains of a ghost-glass spire, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps that hissed through her damaged respirator. She could feel the cold seeping into her primary circulatory system. Her bioarmor, a masterpiece of Osic engineering, was cracked along the sternum, oozing a viscous indigo fluid that hummed with a fading bioluminescence. Her neural damper, the small obsidian implant at the base of her skull, was vibrating at a frantic frequency. It was trying to suppress the encroaching panic, filtering the chemical signals of terror into a dull, manageable static. Weakness is a choice, the high commanders had always told her. Failure is a biological defect. Vexen tried to reach for her monomolecular blade, but her right arm was pinned beneath a ton of crystalline debris. The ghost glass beneath her head began to glow softly, vibrating with the echoes of 1,000 screams from the night the city fell. It was a sensory overload that the dampers struggled to sanitize. Through the haze of pain, she heard a sound that didn't belong to the wind or the shifting glass. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of pressurized boots. A scavenger? A crawler? No. The silhouette that stepped through the curtain of violet mist was too tall, too deliberate. The figure held a long-barreled kinetic rifle with the practiced ease of a veteran. A human. A dust muncher. One of the soft-bodied parasites that had dared to contest the Osic's rightful expansion. Vexen bared her teeth, a defensive reflex that revealed rows of serrated ivory fangs. She expected the flash of the muzzle, the quick end that her kind delivered to any wounded human they found. It would be a mercy compared to the slow crystallization of her blood in the Ethelgard night. The human didn't fire. He stopped 5 meters away, his posture shifting from a combat stance to something more cautious, almost hesitant. His helmet was scarred by shrapnel, the glass of his visor so scratched that Vexen could only see the faint, tired glint of his eyes. "Stark raving mad," the human muttered, his voice amplified by a crackling external speaker. "I'm looking for a data core, and I find a live Talon. My luck is absolutely zero today." Vexen hissed, the sound tearing at her lungs. "Finish it, primate. Your hesitation is an insult to my caste." The human, Major Kaelen Vance, let his rifle hang by its sling. He looked around the desolate square, checking his six with a mechanical flick of his head. "Yeah, well, the world is full of insults, and I'm too bone-tired to care about your caste system right now." He knelt beside her, the movement causing his joints to groan with the weight of his exorig. Vexen flinched, expecting a blow, but the human began to dig into a pouch at his waist. He pulled out a small rectangular device that pulsed with a soft green light. A synaptic suture. "Don't touch me," Vexen rasped, her violet eyes narrowing. "Your touch is a contamination." "Listen, shards," Kaelen said, using the common military slang for her kind. "You're leaking fluid like a busted radiator. If I don't seal that gash, you'll be a decorative statue in 20 minutes. Now stay frosty or I'll have to knock you out, and I'd rather not waste the battery on my stun prod." Vexen watched in a state of cognitive dissonance as the human's gloved hands reached for her armor. Her damper shrieked, a high-pitched whine in her mind that demanded she kill him, but her body was a traitor. She was paralyzed by the sheer absurdity of the moment. Kaelen pried away the shattered plates of her bioarmor with agonizing care. When the raw, indigo flesh was exposed to the biting air, Vexen let out a sharp cry. Kaelen didn't flinch. He activated the suture. A high-frequency hum filled the air, so intense it made the surrounding ghost glass vibrate in sympathy. The device projected a grid of emerald lasers onto Vexen's wound. She felt a sensation like 1,000 white-hot needles stitching through her muscle and bone. It was a human technology, crude, painful, and frighteningly effective. "Easy, easy," Kaelen murmured. It wasn't an order. It was a lullaby, a tone Vexen had never heard. The first 10 seconds are the worst. After that, the local anesthetic in the foam kicks in. He worked with the focus of a craftsman, He wasn't looking at her as a trophy or a monster. He was looking at the wound as a problem to be solved. As the pain began to recede into a dull throb, Vexen found herself staring at the human's face. He had pulled back his visor to see better in the dim light. His skin was tanned, weathered by suns he wasn't born under, and a jagged scar ran from his jaw to the corner of his left eye. "Why?" she asked, her voice losing its edge, replaced by a hollow confusion. "I have extinguished dozens of your kind. I would have burnt your colony to ash if I had reached the northern sector." Kaelen didn't look up from the suture. "Probably, but out here, in this graveyard, you're just another breathing thing that doesn't want to die yet. I've seen enough KIA reports for 3 lifetimes. I'm not adding another soul to the tally today if I can help it." He finished the sealing process, the indigo fluid now replaced by a translucent, shimmering patch of synthetic tissue. He leaned back, sitting on his haunches, and wiped a smudge of silicate dust from his brow. For a moment, the silence of the city was absolute. The ghost glass had stopped echoing, as if the ruins themselves were listening. The light of Ethelgard's moons began to pierce through the violet clouds, reflecting off Vexen's silver hair and the iridescent lines that traced her high cheekbones. Even in her broken state, there was an ethereal symmetry to her features, a terrifying grace that defied the brutal purpose of her existence. Kaelen stared at her for a long beat. The exhaustion in his eyes seemed to lift, replaced by a sudden, jarring realization. He spoke before he could think, the words slipping out like a secret. "You're beautiful." The world stopped. Inside Vexen's head, the neural damper reached a crescendo of static. It was programmed to handle threats, commands, and tactical data. It was not programmed for a subjective aesthetic appreciation from a biological enemy. The word beautiful hit her like a kinetic slug. It wasn't a tactical assessment. It wasn't a threat. It was a bridge. Her violet eyes widened, the pupils dilating until the iris was almost gone. She froze, her entire nervous system locking up in a feedback loop. Her breath hitched. For the first time in her 25 years of life, the damper failed to filter the signal. A wave of warmth, terrifying and alien, rushed from her chest to her throat. "What did you say?" she whispered, the words trembling. Kaelen realized what he'd said, his face flushing a deep red. He looked away, clearing his throat awkwardly. "Nothing, just rambling. The air here is thin, probably the oxygen deprivation talking." But it was too late. The seed was planted. Vexen looked at her own hands, then back at the human who had chosen to heal instead of harm, to see instead of blind himself with hate. The silence of Kizilvash was no longer empty. It was heavy with the weight of a single, impossible word. Moving a wounded talon through the shifting ruins of a sentient city was, in Kaelen's professional opinion, a first-class ticket to a body bag. But as he helped Vexen stand, he realized he was already committed to the madness. He had breached the most fundamental rule of the frontier war: never humanize the shards. "Can you walk, or am I going to have to carry you like a sack of rations?" Kaelen asked, his voice regaining its gruff, military edge. He offered his hand, but his eyes were already scanning the jagged skyline for the telltale shimmer of Osik cloaking fields. Vexen stared at his outstretched hand as if it were a strange, predatory animal. Her pride, a brittle thing manufactured in the breeding pits of the Iron Talon, flared up, but her knees buckled the moment she tried to put weight on her left leg. She snatched his wrist, her grip like a vice even in her weakened state. "I will not be a burden," she hissed, though the effort of standing made her primary lungs burn. "Yeah, keep telling yourself that while we're bugging out," Kaelen grunted. He slung her arm over his shoulder, the cold, smooth texture of her bioarmor pressing against his tactical vest. "We need to get off the street. The sweep teams will be here at 2300 hours, and they don't exactly check for ID before they start blasting." They moved slowly, a clumsy dance of enemies through the labyrinth of Kaelen's nightmares. Kizilvash was a city that refused to die quietly. The ghost glass walls around them shimmered with the pale, flickering images of past lives. A child reaching for a toy, a couple arguing in a doorway, a soldier collapsing in a heap. These weren't ghosts in the traditional sense, but bio-resonant recordings trapped in the crystalline structure of the buildings. Vexen watched the images with a mixture of disgust and fascination. "This city is inefficient," she murmured, her voice straining. Why keep the echoes of the dead? It serves no tactical purpose. It's not for tactics, Vexen, Kaelen replied, glancing at a shimmering image of a woman playing a stringed instrument. It's for memory. So we don't forget that this place wasn't always a pile of rubble. People lived here. They had lives that didn't involve trigger pulls and orbital strikes. Memory is a weakness, she recited, her voice sounding hollow, as if she were reading from a manual she no longer believed in. The past is a weight that slows the stride of the conqueror. Kaelen snorted. Is that what they tell you in the pits? Sounds like a load of grade A fertilizer to me. Without the past, you're just a machine with a heartbeat. And I've killed enough machines to know they're boring. They ducked into the hollowed-out shell of what had once been a grand conservatory. The roof had collapsed, leaving the space open to the bruised sky. Dead, crystallized plants stood like frozen sentinels in the corners. Kaelen guided her to a relatively clear spot behind a fallen pillar and sat her down. He immediately went to work, setting up a series of low-power sensor decoys around their perimeter. His movements were fluid, born of 15 years of surviving on the edge of the galaxy. You are skilled for a soft body, Vexen observed, her eyes following him. The violet glow in her pupils had settled into a steady, contemplative hum. Most humans we encounter scream and die within the first 3 minutes of engagement. I've had a lot of practice not dying, Kaelen said, not looking back. And don't call us soft bodies. We're resilient. We're like those weeds that grow in the cracks of the glass. You can stomp on us, burn us, salt the earth, but the moment you turn your back, we're sprouting up again. He finished with the sensors and sat down opposite her, his rifle resting across his lap. He pulled a ration pack from his rig, tore it open with his teeth, and offered her a dry, gray block of protein. Eat. It tastes like compressed sawdust, but it'll keep your energy levels from flatlining. Vexen sniffed the block suspiciously. It contains no bioluminescent nutrients. My systems require light energy to accelerate healing. Well, unless you want to eat my flashlight, this is all we've got. Take it or starve, shards. Reluctantly, she took a bite, her face contorted in a grimace. It is offensive to the palate. Welcome to the human experience, Kaelen said with a faint, tired smile. Everything is a little bit offensive, but we survive anyway. The silence returned, but it was different now. The tension hadn't vanished, but it had shifted from the threat of violence to the burden of awareness. Vexen leaned her head against the cool ghost glass, the silicate dust on her hair shimmering like a halo. She kept looking at Kaelen, at his scarred face, his steady hands, and the way he didn't seem to hate her. The word you used, she said suddenly, the sound of her own voice startling her. Beautiful. My translators indicate it is a term for high-value aesthetics. Why apply it to a talon? I am a weapon of the Empire. My value is in my lethality. Kaelen paused, a piece of protein halfway to his mouth. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the way the moonlight played across the sharp, alien angles of her face. You're more than a weapon, Vexen. You just don't know it yet. You have this grace. Even when you were trying to hiss my head off, you looked like something that belonged in a museum, not a battlefield. He leaned forward, his voice dropping an octave. Beauty isn't about being useful. In fact, it's the opposite. It's something that exists just for the sake of existing. It's the one thing this war hasn't been able to kill, no matter how hard both sides try. Vexen felt a strange vibration in her chest. Not the mechanical thrum of her armor, but something deeper, more rhythmic. Her neural damper tried to engage, but it was met with a wall of pure emotion that it couldn't categorize. She felt a tear, a drop of clear bioluminescent fluid, leak from her eye and trail down her cheek. She touched the moisture with a trembling finger. I am leaking. Kaelen's expression softened. He reached out, hesitating for a second, then gently wiped the tear away with the pad of his thumb. His touch was warm, a stark contrast to the frozen world around them. It's called crying, Vexen. It happens when the world is too much to carry by yourself. She didn't pull away. She leaned into the touch, a tiny, infinitesimal movement that shattered 30 years of Ossic indoctrination. In that moment, in the heart of a dead city on a dying planet, they weren't Major Vance and Talon Vexen. They were just two lights in the dark, trying to figure out if there was anything left worth saving. "We should sleep," Kaelen said softly, withdrawing his hand. "I'll take the first watch. If the patrols come, I'll wake you." Vexen nodded, her eyes heavy. As she drifted into a fitful slumber, the last thing she saw was the human, silhouetted against the violet ruins, his rifle held tight, his eyes watching the darkness for her. And for the first time in her life, the silence wasn't a discipline, it was a promise. The morning light on Ethelgard did not arrive with a golden glow. It crept through the ruins like a pale, spectral tide. The silicate mist had settled into the lower streets, forming a thick, sparkling fog that turned the jagged remains of the city into a forest of frosted blades. Inside the conservatory, the temperature had dropped to several degrees below freezing. Major Kaelen Vance was already awake, his breath blooming in white clouds against the frosted interior of his visor. He was checking the power cells on his kinetic rifle, his fingers moving with a mechanical rhythm that spoke of 20 years of repetition. He glanced over at Vexen. The Ossic warrior was still asleep, or at least in the deep meditative trance her species used to bypass biological exhaustion. Her silver hair was fanned out against the ghost glass floor, and in the low light, the iridescent lines on her skin pulsed with a faint, rhythmic violet glow. She looked less like a weapon and more like a work of art, one that had been dropped from a great height and poorly glued back together. Kaelen sighed and tapped his comms. Static. The ionosphere of this planet was a mess of interference, even on a good day, but the recent orbital strikes had turned the air into a soup of radio-blocking particles. They were effectively ghosting, no signal, no extraction, no backup. He was 1,000 kilometers from the nearest human outpost, with a wounded enemy officer who might or might not try to slit his throat once she found her feet. "Typical Tuesday," he muttered under his breath. He stood up, his exosuit whirring softly as the hydraulic servos compensated for his stiff muscles. He walked to the edge of the conservatory, peering through a gap in the shattered glass. The street below was a graveyard of abandoned vehicles and crystallized corpses. "You speak to yourself often, human." Vexen's voice came from the shadows, sharp and dry. She was sitting up, her hand instinctively hovering over the handle of her shattered blade. "Is it a symptom of your species' cognitive decay? A lack of internal cohesion?" Kaelen didn't turn around. "It's called a habit, Vexen. Keeps the silence from getting too loud. How's the gash? The suit you're holding up?" Vexen looked down at her side. The shimmering patch was firm, though the surrounding skin was a bruised shade of indigo. "The cellular regeneration is proceeding at 72% efficiency. Your primitive medicine is surprisingly compatible with Ossic physiology, though the pain spikes are persistent." "That's the synaptic feedback," Kaelen said, finally turning toward her. "The foam forces the nerves to reconnect. It's like being stung by a million tiny hornets all at once. But hey, at least you're walking, or at least you're going to be. We need to move. If we stay in one spot for more than 6 hours, we're just waiting for a click call from an Ossic hunter-killer team." "A click call?" Vexen tilted her head, her silver hair shimmering in the mist. "Military slang," Kaelen explained, checking his motion tracker. "It means someone's going to drop a high-explosive round on our heads. Now let's get you Oscar Mike. That means on the move, and in case you were wondering." He helped her up, his hands steady as he braced her weight. The contact sent a jolt through Vexen's failing neural damper. The device was screaming at her, throwing red-line warnings across her internal HUD, telling her that the human's proximity was a violation of Protocol 42. But the warmth of his hand felt more real than the cold logic of the Empire. They stepped out into the shimmering labyrinth. Kaisel Vosh had once been the jewel of the Outer Rim, a city where art and science lived in a delicate balance. Now it was a trap. The ghost glass buildings were not just structures, they were recorders. As they walked, the silicate dust on the ground vibrated under their boots, triggering dormant memories in the glass. To their left, the shimmering image of a young human girl appeared. She was laughing, running through a plaza that was now nothing but blackened stone. She disappeared after 3 steps, her laughter echoing for a fraction of a second before the wind swallowed it. Vexen stopped, her violet eyes wide. "What was that? A localized holographic projection?" "No," Kaelen said, his voice dropping into a low, somber tone. That's the city. Ghost glass absorbs bioelectric signatures during high-stress events, or just long-term exposure. That girl, she probably lived here for years before the war. The glass remembers her joy just as much as it remembers the fire. It is a waste of energy, Vexen insisted, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. To store the data of a non-combatant. It serves no strategic purpose for the hive. Maybe the hive is wrong, Kaelen replied, nudging her forward. Maybe the things that don't have a strategic purpose are the only things that actually matter. Like that song I was humming, or the way that girl was laughing. Namontuni. They moved deeper into the residential district, navigating through streets that felt like a hall of mirrors. At every turn, they saw flashes of the past. A man painting a canvas that was now dust. A grandmother holding a child. A group of friends sharing a meal at a table that had long since been incinerated. Vexen found herself slowing down, her eyes darting from one memory to another. Her damper was struggling to process the sheer volume of subjective data. She saw a human male and female standing in a garden, their foreheads pressed together in a gesture of profound intimacy. The glass vibrated, and Vexen heard a whisper of a word she didn't recognize in her own tongue, but her translator identified as devotion. My people do not have this, she whispered almost to herself. We have the chain of command. We have the bond of the blade, but we do not have this. It's called love, Vexen, Kaelen said, his gaze fixed on the fading image of the couple. It's the most inefficient, irrational, and tactically sound reason to stay alive. It's why we fight so hard. We're not fighting for territory or resources, not really. We're fighting so those two people in the garden can have another 5 minutes of peace. Vexen looked at Kaelen. And you? Who are you fighting for, Major? Kaelen's expression darkened. He looked away, his jaw tightening. Nobody left. My unit was wiped out in the initial breach. My family, they were on the transport that didn't make it past the blockade. I'm just a ghost walking through a ghost city now. Then why did you save me? Vexen pressed. If you have nothing to return to, why risk your survival for a weapon of the enemy? Kaelen stopped and turned to her. The mist was swirling around them, and for a moment the ruins seemed to vanish, leaving only the two of them in a void of violet light. Because if I stop caring, Vexen, then the war has already won. If I look at you and only see an enemy, then I'm no better than the machines that leveled this city. I saved you because you were bleeding, because you were alive, and because for a split second, I wanted to see something beautiful in this God-forsaken place instead of another corpse. Vexen felt the word beautiful resonate through her marrow. It was no longer just an aesthetic term, it was an anchor. She looked at the scars on Kaelen's face, the exhaustion in his eyes, and the stubborn way he refused to give up on his own humanity. You are a strange creature, Kaelen Vance, she said, her voice softer than it had ever been. A human who carries his heart on the outside of his armor. It is a wonder your species has survived at all. Yeah, well, we're persistent like that, Kaelen said, giving her a lopsided grin. Now come on. We've got another 3 kilometers to cover before we find a decent place to hole up for the night. And watch your step. The glass in this sector is prone to resonance fractures. If you step on a high memory patch, you might trigger a sensory blast that'll knock your damper into next week. They continued their trek, 2 silhouettes against the shimmering backdrop of a lost world. They were an impossible pair, a soldier of a broken race and a warrior of a soulless empire, walking through a city that refused to let go of its memories. They didn't know it yet, but they were no longer just survivors. They were the first notes of a symphony that would eventually shake the foundation of the stars. By the time the 2 moons of Ethelgard reached their zenith, the temperature had plummeted to 30 degrees below zero. The silicate mist had frozen into tiny, crystalline needles that stung against any exposed skin. Kaelen had found a temporary sanctuary in the sub-basement of an old civic archive. The walls were thick, reinforced with lead and carbon fiber, which provided a much-needed break from the relentless whispers of the ghost glass. Kaelen had managed to scavenge a portable thermal unit from the ruins of a human medical tent nearby. It hummed with a low, comforting vibration, casting an orange glow that flickered against the stacks of rotting data wafers and forgotten scrolls. Vexen sat near the heat, her armor powered down to conserve her remaining bioenergy. She was watching Kaelen as he cleaned the carbon scoring from his rifle's barrel. He was meticulous, his hands moving with a grace that she had previously associated only with high-caste duelists. "Your weapon is primitive," Vexen said, breaking the silence. "It relies on chemical propellants and kinetic slugs. Our plasma casters are more efficient, more precise." Kaelen didn't look up. "Maybe, but a kinetic slug doesn't care about electromagnetic interference. It doesn't need a battery to tell it how to fly. It's simple, reliable, and it gets the job done when things go south. Sometimes simple is better, Shards." "Things go south?" Vexen asked, the idiom once again confusing her translator. "Military slang for when everything goes foobar," Kaelen said, then realized he was adding more slang. "Fucked up beyond all recognition. It means when the plan falls apart and you're left with nothing but your guts and your gun." Vexen processed this. "The OSIC do not have a term for this. We do not allow plans to fall apart. We adapt, we calculate, we conquer." "Yeah, well, everyone's a genius until they get punched in the mouth," Kaelen muttered, finally setting the rifle aside. He looked at her, his eyes serious in the orange light. "Vexen, your damper. It's glitching, isn't it? I can see the flicker in your eyes." Vexen stiffened, her silver hair catching the firelight. "It is. Struggling with the sensory environment of this city. The bioresonant feedback is causing a synchronization error. It will be corrected once I return to the hive." "Will it?" Kaelen asked, leaning forward. "Or do you want it corrected? Because from where I'm sitting, you're starting to see things. You're starting to feel things. And once that door opens, you can't just slam it shut again without losing a piece of yourself." "I am a Talon," Vexen's voice rose, a flash of her old ferocity returning. "I do not wish to feel. Feeling is a corruption. It leads to hesitation, and hesitation leads to death." "Is that so?" Kaelen challenged. "Because you didn't hesitate when I was patching you up. You didn't hesitate when we were walking through those memories. You were curious. You were engaged. That's not corruption, Vexen. That's consciousness." Before she could respond, Kalen's motion sensor on the table let out a sharp staccato beep. His entire demeanor changed in a microsecond. The tired, philosophical soldier was gone, replaced by a predator. He grabbed his rifle and doused the thermal unit, plunging the room into darkness. "Movement," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. 200 meters out, coming from the north. They're moving fast, too fast for scavengers." Vexen closed her eyes, tapping into her armor's passive sensors. She felt a familiar vibration, a high-frequency hum that made her skin crawl. "OSIC," she breathed. "A Talon strike team. 4 units. They are tracking the bioluminescent trail of my armor." "Well, so much for a quiet night," Kaelen said, sliding a fresh magazine into his rifle. "We can't stay here. This basement is a tomb if they pin us down. We need to get back up to the surface and use the glass for cover." They moved with urgent silence, creeping up the stairs and back into the frosted ruins. The night was eerily quiet, the wind having died down to a low moan. Kaelen led the way, using his thermal goggles to pick out the cold silhouettes of the city. Suddenly, a beam of blinding white light cut through the mist, illuminating the street like a stage. "Vexen of the Iron Talon!" a voice boomed, amplified by an OSIC sonic projector. It was a cold, metallic sound that seemed to vibrate in the very air. "You are detected. Your biosignature indicates survival. State your status and the location of the human parasite." Kaelen and Vexen crouched behind a pile of shattered glass. A few meters away, 4 OSIC warriors stepped out of the fog. They were taller than Vexen, their armor a matte black that seemed to swallow the light. They carried long, curved plasma casters that hummed with lethal intent. Their leader, a warrior with a jagged scar across his faceplate, stepped forward. "Captain Xylar," Vexen whispered, her voice trembling. "He was my mentor in the breeding pits. He is efficient." "I bet," Kaelen muttered, checking his sights. "Listen, Vexen, if you want to go back, this is your chance. You could tell them I took you prisoner. You could play the hero." Vexen looked at Kaelen. In the dim light, she saw no judgment in his eyes, only a quiet, resigned expectation. He was giving her a choice, the first real choice she had ever been offered. "Vexen," Xylar's voice came again, closer now. "You have 3 seconds to identify. If you do not comply, We will initiate a thermal purge of this sector. You know the protocol. The weak are pruned. The traitors are erased. Vexen felt her damper flare, a surge of icy coldness trying to drown out her heart. She thought of the human girl in the memory. She thought of the couple in the garden. She thought of Kaelen's thumb wiping away her tear. I am no longer a part of your protocol, Vexen whispered to herself. She stood up, stepping out from behind the pillar into the white glare of the searchlight. Captain Xylar, she called out, her voice echoing through the ruins. The human is under my protection. You will withdraw from this sector. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ghost glass seemed to hold its breath. Xylar tilted his head, a gesture of mechanical curiosity. Protection? You use the language of the soft bodies, Vexen. Your damper has been compromised. You are no longer a Talon. You are a malfunction. He raised his plasma caster. Initiate the purge. Hit the dirt, Kaelen yelled, popping up from his cover. He opened fire, the thunderous crack of his kinetic rifle shattering the silence. His first shot struck the shoulder of an Ossic warrior, the high-velocity slug tearing through the bioarmor and sending a spray of indigo fluid into the air. Vexen didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, her shattered blade glowing with a sudden, desperate light. She moved like a silver blur, weaving through the plasma bolts that turned the air into ozone. She reached the first warrior before he could recalibrate his sights, her blade finding the weak point in his neck seal. The battle was a chaotic symphony of light and sound. Kaelen moved with a grim efficiency, his rifle barking as he provided cover fire for Vexen. He was stirring the soup, as the slang went, keeping the enemy off balance, forcing them to react to two threats at once. Left flank, Vexen! Duck! Kaelen roared. Vexen dropped low as a bolt of blue plasma screamed over her head, incinerating a patch of ghost glass behind her. She rolled, coming up behind another warrior and driving her blade through his primary heart core. But Xylar was faster. He swung his caster like a club, catching Vexen in the chest and sending her flying across the street. She crashed into a crystalline wall, the impact cracking the ghost glass and triggering a massive sensory feedback loop. Images of the city's destruction flooded the air. Screams, fire, the smell of burning ozone. The glass wailed in 1,000 voices. Kaelen tried to move toward her, but Xylar turned his weapon on him. A plasma bolt struck the ground inches from Kaelen's feet, the heat so intense it melted his boots to the pavement. He was pinned down, his rifle empty, his sidearm jammed. Xylar stepped toward him, his face played a mask of cold, unblinking death. You are the cause of this malfunction, human. You have whispered poison into the ear of a warrior. Now I will remove the source of the infection. He raised the plasma caster, the tip of the weapon glowing with a lethal white light. Wait, Vexen's voice came from the wreckage, weak but clear. Xylar paused. Vexen stood up, her armor shattered, her skin bleeding indigo in a dozen places. She wasn't looking at Xylar. She was looking at Kaelen. He said, I was beautiful, Vexen whispered. Xylar let out a harsh metallic laugh. A subjective assessment from a dying primate. It means nothing. It means everything, Vexen said. She didn't use her blade. She reached into her own chest, into the cracked plate of her armor, and pulled out her own power core. It was a sphere of pure, pulsating violet energy, the very thing that kept her alive. Vexen, don't! Kaelen screamed. She looked at him one last time, a faint, human-like smile touching her lips. Then she slammed the core into the ghost glass wall behind her. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The energy from the core resonated with the memory-laden glass, creating a massive bioelectric shockwave. The street erupted in a blinding flash of violet light. The sound was not an explosion, but a scream. A million voices of the past joining together in a single, defiant roar. The shockwave hit the Ossic warriors like a physical wall, their electronic systems overloading, their dampers shattering under the sheer weight of the emotional feedback. They collapsed like puppets with their strings cut, their armor sparking and smoking. Xylar was thrown back 20 meters, his faceplate cracked, his plasma caster reduced to a useless hunk of metal. Then there was silence. The violet light faded, leaving the street in a thick, choking darkness. Kaelen struggled to his feet, his ears ringing, his vision blurred. He stumbled toward the wreckage where Vexen had fallen. Vexen! Vexen! Talk to me! He found her slumped against the wall. The ghost glass around her was blackened, its memories burned away. Her eyes were closed, the glow in her skin almost gone. She was cold, colder than the Ethelgard night. Don't you dare, Kaelen whispered, his voice breaking. Don't you dare go out on me now, you stubborn shard. He fumbled for his med kit, but he knew he was out of synaptic sutures. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. Vexen, please. Her eyes flickered open. The violet was dim, like a dying ember, but it was there. She looked at him, her gaze clear and unfettered by the damper for the first time. Kaelen, she whispered, I'm here. I'm right here. The silence is gone, she said, her voice a mere ghost of a sound. I can hear everything. Just hold on, Vexen. We're going to get out of here. We're going to find a way. She reached up, her fingers brushing the scar on his jaw. You were right, Major. The things that serve no strategic purpose are the only things that matter. She closed her eyes again, her breathing shallow but steady. She was alive, but the price had been her connection to the hive, her identity as a Talon, and the very energy that sustained her. Kaelen looked up at the broken skyline. He knew the Ossik wouldn't stop. Xylar would recover, and more teams would be sent. They were now the two most wanted fugitives on the planet. But as he looked down at the alien woman in his arms, the woman who had sacrificed her soul to save his life, he didn't feel afraid. He felt a strange, defiant spark of hope. We're Fubar, Vexen, he whispered, a tired smile touching his lips. Absolutely 100% gone south. But we're still breathing, and as long as we're breathing, we're beautiful. He picked her up, her weight light and fragile in his arms, and began to walk. He didn't head for the outposts or the extraction zones. He headed deeper into the ruins, into the places where the shadows were longest and the memories were strongest. The war was still raging in the stars above, but down here in the heart of Kaisel Vosh, a new kind of history was being written. One that wasn't recorded in data wafers or military reports, but in the enduring resonance of a single, impossible choice. The archive of lost souls lay buried beneath 40 meters of reinforced concrete on lead-lined insulation. It was a cathedral of data, a subterranean vault where the pre-war civilization of Ethelgard had stored their collective consciousness. Above, the city of Kizelvosh whistled with the wind and the screams of ghost glass. But down here, the silence was heavy, almost physical. It was the kind of quiet that made a man hear the rushing of his own blood and the ticking of a heart that had beaten far too many times in the presence of death. Kaelen Vance moved through the darkness, the beam of his shoulder-mounted lamp cutting a narrow path through the dust. He was carrying Vexen. She was a lightweight, far lighter than a soldier in full kit should be, her bioarmor now little more than a shattered husk of indigo plates. Her breathing was a thin, thready rasp against his neck. Hang in there, shards, Kaelen whispered, his voice sounding like gravel grinding together. We're in the deep six now. No sensors are going to pick us up through this much lead. Just stay frosty. He found a central terminal bay, a circular chamber lined with towering stacks of glass wafers that reached toward the shadowed ceiling. He lowered Vexen onto a stone dais that had once held a holographic projector. She groaned, her hand clutching at her chest where her power core had once pulsed. The indigo lines on her skin were dark, as if the very ink of her soul had run dry. Kaelen, she gasped, her violet eyes fluttering open. They were no longer glowing. They were deep, dark pools of exhaustion. The static, it is gone. But the noise inside is too much. That's not noise, Vexen. That's you, Kaelen said, his hands moving with frantic precision as he dug through his pack. He pulled out his last emergency power cell and a set of jumper leads he'd scavenged from a downed Ossik drone. Your damper is toasted, completely fried. You're feeling every chemical spike your brain throws out without a filter. It's a hell of a ride, I know. It is. Agony, she whispered. I feel the cold. I feel the weight of the stone above us. I feel the regret for the warriors I extinguished tonight. Why do I regret? They were the pruning shears of the hive. I was the rot. Kaelen stopped, a jumper lead in each hand. He looked at her, his heart twisting in a way that had nothing to do with combat fatigue. You weren't rot, Vexen. You were a person being told she was a tool. Now the tool is broken, and the person is all that's left. It's going to hurt like a son of a gun for a while. He attached the leads to the interface port at the base of her skull, bypassing the charred remains of the neural damper. He watched the diagnostic screen on his wrist link. The power cell began to hum, feeding a steady trickle of electrons into her primary nervous system. It wasn't enough to make her a warrior again, but it was enough to keep her heart from seizing. As the power stabilized, the archive itself seemed to wake up. The ambient bioelectricity from Vexen's rejuvenated core bled into the nearby wafers. A soft, amber glow began to permeate the room. Suddenly, the air was filled with light. 1,000 holographic windows opened simultaneously, hovering in the air, like the wings of translucent birds. They were records, personal diaries, medical files, legal briefs, and family photos. The ghost glass of the archive was reacting to the presence of an OSIC core, however weak it was. Vexen stared at the images. To her left, a video played of a human wedding. 2 people laughing as they were showered with flower petals. To her right, a schematic of a human heart flickered, followed by a series of neurological maps. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice gaining a fraction of its former strength. "The collective memory of Ethelgard," Kaelen said, leaning back against the dais. He wiped a smudge of grease from his visor. "Before the war, the people here were obsessed with legacy. They didn't want anything to be lost. Every thought, every discovery, they put it here." Vexen reached out a trembling hand, her fingers passing through the holographic image of a child playing with a mechanical dog. So many soft bodies, so many lives wasted on trivialities. Why keep a record of a child playing? What is the tactical value of a smile? "The value is that it happened, Vexen," Kaelen said quietly. "Life isn't a zero-sum game of tactical gains. It's a collection of small, useless moments that make the big ones worth fighting for." He turned to a larger terminal, his fingers dancing over a cracked keyboard. He was looking for something specific, a way out, a map of the subterranean tunnels. But his eyes caught a file header that stopped his heart. Project Sentinel, Neurological Adaptation and Trauma Suppression. "Vexen, look at this," Kaelen said, his voice dropping to a sharp whisper. He pulled the window toward the center of the room. The date on the file was from 60 years ago, 10 years before the war even started. The logo on the header wasn't OSIC. It was the seal of the United Human Colonies Medical Division. As they read, the truth began to peel away like scorched skin. The neural damper, the very device that defined the OSIC hive, wasn't an alien invention. It was a human one. It had been designed as a medical miracle to help soldiers suffering from extreme psychological trauma, a way to dampen the horrific memories of the early border wars so they could return to their families. But the data showed a darker turn. A high-ranking human officer, a man named General Valerius, had seen a different potential for the tech. He hadn't wanted to heal soldiers. He had wanted to create ones who couldn't be broken. He had sold the prototypes to a radical splinter faction of the OSIC, the original Iron Talon, in exchange for planetary mining rights. The OSIC hadn't conquered the humans. They had been optimized by them. The Iron Talon had taken the human tech and turned it on their own people, culling the emotional elites and ceding control to the hive mind, all powered by a stolen human algorithm. Vexen stared at the screen, her violet eyes reflecting the scrolling lines of code. The revelation hit her harder than any physical blow. Her entire history, her pride, her very identity as a superior being, it was all based on a repurposed human medical tool and a dirty backroom deal. "We are a mistake," she whispered. Her breath hitched, a sound of pure, unfiltered grief. "We are not the pinnacle of evolution. We are a human experiment that went out of control." "Vexen, listen to me," Kaelen said, grabbing her shoulders. "It doesn't matter where it came from. It doesn't change who you are right now." "It changes everything," she shrieked, the sound echoing through the vast vault. "I have killed thousands in the name of a purity that does not exist. I have suppressed my soul with a chip designed by your kind to stop a soldier from crying. I am a lie, Kaelen, a walking, breathing lie." She tried to tear the leads from her head, her movements frantic and self-destructive. Kaelen pinned her arms to her sides, bracing himself against the dais. "Stop it! Look at me!" he roared. She froze, her chest heaving, tears of indigo bioluminescence streaming down her face. "You're not a lie," Kaelen said, his voice cracking with an intensity that surprised even him. "The tech is a lie. The war is a lie. But the fact that you're sitting here, feeling like your heart is being ripped out, that's the most real thing in this entire star system. You're not a Talon anymore. You're Vexen, and Vexen is enough." Vexen slumped against him, her silver hair spilling over his armored chest. The silence of the archive returned, but it was no longer heavy. It was a witness. The turning point had arrived. The wall between us and them hadn't just been breached, it had been revealed to be a mirror. They weren't fighting an alien monster. They were fighting the worst parts of their own history. "What do we do?" Vexen asked, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "If the Hive finds out, if my people realize their god is a human subroutine, then the war ends," Kaelen said, his eyes turning toward the elevator shaft that led back to the surface. "Or it burns everything down. But either way, we're not hiding in this hole forever. We're going to take this data, and we're going to scream it across every frequency in the galaxy." He looked at the power cell. It had about 6 hours of juice left, 6 hours to cross 3 kilometers of enemy-occupied ruins to reach the old broadcast spire. "Can you move, shards?" he asked, using the slang not as an insult, but as a term of endearment. Vexen pulled back, wiping her eyes. The violet glow was returning, but it was different now, softer, more human. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. "I am Oscar Mike, Major," she said, a ghost of a smile appearing on her lips. "Let's go punch the Hive in the mouth." The ascent from the archive was a grueling climb through the skeleton of a world. The elevator had been dead for 30 years, leaving them to navigate a vertical shaft of rusted iron and dangling cables. Kaelen climbed with Vexen strapped to his back, her arms locked around his neck. Every movement was a test of his exosuit's failing batteries and his own screaming tendons. 200 meters to the surface," Kaelen grunted, his boots slipping on a patch of frozen grease. "Hang tight, Vexen. Don't let go, even if the world starts shaking." "I am not going anywhere," she replied, her voice steady against his ear. As they climbed, Vexen's mind was a battlefield. Without the damper, the memories of her training, the pruning ceremonies, the cold, silent meals, the executions of those deemed inefficient, played on a loop. She felt the weight of every life she had taken, a crushing pressure that made it hard to breathe. "Kaelen," she whispered as they reached a maintenance landing, "the soldiers, the ones I killed tonight. I can see their faces. I can feel the moment their light went out. How do you do it? How do you humans carry this every day without screaming until your lungs burst?" Kaelen hauled himself onto the landing, unstrapping her so he could catch his breath. He slumped against the wall, his helmet hiss-popping as he opened the seals. The air in the shaft was stale, smelling of ozone and old dust. "We don't carry it all at once," he said, his eyes fixed on the darkness below. "If you try to hold the whole weight of the war, it'll crush you into a pancake. You just carry the next step. You carry the person next to you. And sometimes you just carry the hope that tomorrow won't be as shitty as today." He looked at her, his face pale and lined with fatigue. "And you do scream, Vexen. In your head, late at night, when the sensors are quiet. You scream until you're empty, and then you fill that space with something else. Anything else. A song, a memory of a good meal, a girl in a garden." Vexen sat beside him, her silver hair glowing faintly in the dark. She reached out and touched his cheek, her skin feeling more like silk than the cold metal it had resembled a day ago. "The girl in the garden," she said. "She was beautiful because she was loved. I understand now. Beauty is not a visual property. It is the reflection of worth. You called me beautiful because you saw worth in me when I saw only a weapon." "Bingo," Kaelen said, a small, sad smile touching his lips. "You catch on quick for a shard." They rested for 10 minutes, but the peace was short-lived. A distant rhythmic thumping echoed through the shaft, the sound of mechanical legs hitting steel. "They're in the shaft," Kaelen said, snapping his visor shut. "Striders! Ossic hunter-killers. They must have picked up the power surge from the archive. They will be upon us in 5 minutes, Vexen said, her tactical training overriding her grief. We cannot outrun them in the shaft. We need to reach the surface level now. They scrambled up the last 50 meters, bursting through a rusted maintenance hatch into the ruins of the HFY Central Transit Hub. It was a massive, glass-domed station, now a jagged cathedral of shadows. The silicate mist was pouring through the shattered dome, creating a swirling vortex of white dust. There! The spire! Kaelen pointed toward a needle-thin tower that rose from the center of the station. It was the old planetary broadcast array, still standing despite the orbital bombardment. They ran, their boots echoing across the cracked marble floors. Behind them, the hatch they had just exited was ripped off its hinges by a massive, three-legged strider. The machine was a nightmare of matte black metal and red sensor eyes, its multi-jointed legs clicking with terrifying speed. "Cover me!" Kaelen yelled, spinning around and dropping to one knee. He opened fire, his kinetic rifle roaring in the confined space. The slug sparked off the strider's heavy frontal plating, doing little more than drawing its attention. The machine let out a high-pitched sonic screech and unleashed a volley of micromissiles. "Get down!" Vexen lunged at Kaelen, tackling him behind a fallen ticket kiosk just as the missiles impacted. The world vanished in a roar of fire and flying marble. Kaelen felt the shock wave rattle his teeth. He looked up, his vision swimming. The kiosk was shredded, and Vexen was lying face down in the dust, her armor sparking. "Vexen, move! Move! Move!" He grabbed her by the harness and dragged her toward the base of the spire. The strider was looming over them, its red eyes glowing with a malevolent light. It raised a heavy thermal cannon, the air around the muzzle beginning to shimmer with intense heat. "This is it," Kaelen thought, his finger tightening on his empty rifle's trigger. "This is where the plan goes foobar for the last time." But the shot never came. A blast of blue plasma struck the strider from the side, tearing through its leg joints and sending the massive machine crashing to the floor. Kaelen blinked, looking toward the source of the fire. Standing in the shadows of the transit hub was a group of 5 warriors. They looked like Osig, but their armor was different, scavenged, mismatched, and painted with crude white symbols of a blooming flower. "Rebels?" Kaelen whispered. The leader stepped forward, his faceplate retracted to reveal an old Osig male, his skin gray and weathered, his eyes devoid of any neural damper. He carried a human-made pulse rifle with the ease of a master. "We heard the signal from the archive," the old warrior said, his voice a deep, resonant rumble. "We have waited 30 years for someone to find the truth. We are the Unbound." Vexen struggled to her feet, her gaze fixed on the old man. "The Unbound, the ones who fled the hive. The legend said you were all executed." "The hive lies to keep the silence," the old man said, looking at Vexen with a strange fatherly sadness. "We survived in the deep places. We felt the resonance of your core when you broke your damper, child. It was like a bell ringing in a graveyard." He turned to Kaelen, his eyes narrowing. "And you, human, you are the catalyst, a major of the frontier, protecting a Talon. The universe has a strange sense of irony." "Irony is my middle name," Kaelen panted, leaning on his rifle. "Listen, we've got the data from Project Sentinel. We need to broadcast it. If your people see the truth, the hive collapses." "The hive will not collapse quietly," the leader of the Unbound warned. "They are already sending the heavy hitters. But we will hold the hub. You reach the spire. Give the people back their souls, human." Kaelen nodded, looking at Vexen. She was staring at the Unbound, her expression a mix of awe and terror. She was seeing the cost of her people's silence, the small, flickering flame of a resistance that had survived on nothing but hope. "You heard the man, Vexen," Kaelen said, offering her his hand. "Time to go to work." They began the final climb up the spire, leaving the Unbound to face the storm. As they ascended the spiral staircase, the sound of the battle below grew louder. The crash of plasma, the roar of kinetic fire, and the screams of dying machines. Vexen looked down once, her heart pounding in her ears. "They are dying for us, Kaelen." "Why? They do not even know us." "They're not dying for us," Kaelen said, his voice grim. "They're dying for the idea of us. They're dying so that the next generation of Osik doesn't have to be born with a chip in their head. That's the highest price anyone can pay, Vexen. And it's the only way things ever change. They reached the broadcast room at the top of the spire. It was a small, circular chamber filled with ancient equipment that hummed with a dormant power. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, they could see the entire ruins of Kaisel Vosh, a city of glass and ghosts stretching out toward the horizon. Kaelen slammed the data wafer into the primary console. System initiate planetary broadcast, all frequencies, all bands. Override Hive encryption using the Sentinel protocols. Authentication required, the computer chirped. General Valerius biometric or equivalent human command code. Kaelen froze. Valerius? That bastard. He locked the broadcast to his own line. I can bypass it, Vexen said, stepping forward. She looked at the interface, her violet eyes flashing with a sudden, brilliant intensity. My armor's core, it's still linked to the Hive's root access. If I plug myself in, I can act as a bridge. I can force the code through. Vexen, no, Kaelen said, grabbing her arm. The feedback will kill you. Your core is already failing. If you pump that much data through your nervous system, you'll burn out in seconds. She looked at him, and for the first time, she looked truly at peace. The fear was gone. The regret was gone. There was only a clear, shimmering purpose. Kaelen, she said softly, you called me beautiful. You told me I had worth. This is my worth. This is the one thing I was born to do, not to kill, but to speak. I am not a weapon anymore. I am the voice of the unbound. She pulled her hand from his and pressed it against the console's interface plate. Vexen, don't do it. Goodbye, Major, she whispered. Thank you. For the garden. A blinding flash of violet light erupted from the console, lashing out like a swarm of angry wasps. Vexen's body arched, her silver hair standing on end as the raw data of Project Sentinel poured through her, into the spire, and out across the sky. The ghost glass of the city began to glow. Every window, every spire, every shard of glass on the ground turned a brilliant, pulsing amber. The memories of Ethelgar were being overwritten by the truth. In the skies above, the Osik fleet began to shudder. Thousands of warriors suddenly clutched their heads as the silence of their dampers was replaced by the screams of 60 years of suppressed humanity. The hive mind was fracturing, a million individual souls waking up at once into a nightmare of their own making. Kaelen watched in horror and awe as Vexen's body began to turn translucent, her physical form dissolving into the very light she was broadcasting. She was becoming a part of the ghost glass, a memory that would never be forgotten. No, no, Vexen! Kaelen fell to his knees, his hand reaching for a light he couldn't touch. The broadcast lasted for precisely 60 seconds, 1 minute that changed the history of the galaxy. When the light finally faded, the spire was silent. The console was a melted heap of slag. Vexen was gone. Kaelen sat in the center of the room, the silence of the city pressing in on him. He looked out the window. The silicate mist was clearing, and for the first time in 30 years, he could see the stars. They were beautiful. But the price was a hole in his heart that no medical tech could ever suture. He reached into the dust on the floor and pulled out a small, round piece of glass, a fragment of a mirror he had given her. In its cracked surface, he saw his own reflection. He looked old. He looked tired. But as he looked closer, he saw something else. He saw the reflection of a man who had finally stopped being a soldier and started being a human again. She's still here, Kaelen whispered to the empty room. She's in the glass. She's in the wind. She's in the truth. He stood up, his bones aching, and began to walk back down the spire. The war wasn't over. There would be chaos. There would be blood. And there would be a long, painful road to recovery for two species that had forgotten how to feel. But as he stepped out into the ruins of Kaisel Vosh, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. In the center of the transit hub, the Osik warriors who had been trying to kill him were sitting on the ground. Their helmets were off. They were looking at their hands. They were looking at the sky, and they were crying. Kaelen walked past them, his rifle slung low. He didn't fire. He didn't even look at them with hate. He just walked out into the first real morning Ethelgard had seen in half a century. He had learned the lesson, even if it had cost him the only thing that made the lesson worth learning. He knew now that an enemy is just a friend you haven't healed yet, and that beauty. Beauty is the only weapon that can actually win a war. The silence that followed the broadcast was not empty. It was heavy, suffocating, and filled with a billion voices that had forgotten how to speak. Major Kaelen Vance stood in the ruins of the transit hub, his boots crunching on the frozen remains of marble and glass. Around him, the warriors of the Iron Talon, the most feared strike force in the galaxy, were no longer warriors. They were broken shells. Some were clutching their heads, their fingers digging into the gaps of their matte black armor. Others were curled in the fetal position, their primary and secondary lungs laboring in a frantic, uneven rhythm. Without the neural damper, the sudden influx of decades of suppressed trauma was hitting them like a physical blow. They were experiencing 30 years of grief, fear, and shame in the span of 30 seconds. "Check your corners," Kaelen barked, his voice cracking with exhaustion. He wasn't talking to the Ossic. Behind him, a handful of human scouts had emerged from the shadows, their rifles raised, their faces a mask of confusion and predatory intent. "Major?" a young corporal named Elias whispered, his weapon trained on an Ossic warrior who was sobbing silently into the dust. "What the hell is this? Is this some kind of bioweapon? Should we start clearing the room?" "Lower your iron, Corporal," Kaelen said, stepping into the line of fire. He didn't have his rifle raised. He didn't even have his hand on his sidearm. "They're not a threat." "Not a threat?" Elias scoffed, his eyes wide with adrenaline. "Major, they've been stacking our boys like cordwood for 3 decades. This is a gift. If their systems are down, we finish this. Right here. Right now." "I said lower the weapons," Kaelen repeated, his tone dropping into a low, dangerous register. "Look at them, Elias. Really look at them. Do those look like monsters to you? They're awake. The damper is gone. If you kill them now, you're not a soldier. You're just a butcher in a fancy suit." The human scouts hesitated. The air in the hub was thick with the smell of ozone and the shimmering silicate mist. For 30 years, the war had been simple. Blue blood versus red blood. Kinetic slugs versus plasma bolts. Now the math had changed, and the variables were bleeding. Suddenly, the ghost glass walls of the station flared with a soft, pulsing violet light. It wasn't the jagged, angry light of the broadcast. It was something else. A silhouette began to form within the crystalline structure of a nearby pillar. It was Vexen. She wasn't solid, but she wasn't a mere recording either. She was a flicker in the data, a ghost in the machine of the city. "Kaelen," the voice whispered. It didn't come from the air. It came from the resonance in the glass, a vibration that Kaelen felt in his very marrow. "The transition is unstable. The hive mind is attempting to reassert control. They are sending a signal pulse to incinerate the corrupted units. You have to move them, now." "Vexen?" Kaelen reached out, his hand passing through the cold surface of the pillar. "Where are you? How are you doing this?" "I am the glass," she replied, her image flickering like a dying candle. "The memory of the city has absorbed my bioresonance signature. I am everywhere and nowhere. But my time is short. The hive is coming. They will burn this city to the ground to hide the truth." Kaelen turned to the old warrior of the Unbound, who was helping a young Ossic initiate to his feet. "Old man, can you lead them? We need to get into the tunnels. Deep. If the hive drops an orbital strike, the surface is going to be a glass fire." "We know the ways," the old warrior said, his voice a steady anchor in the chaos. "But they are many, and we are few. They are terrified, Major. They have no name for what they are feeling." "Tell them it's called being human," Kaelen said, grabbing a nearby Ossic by the shoulder. The warrior flinched, his violet eyes wide and wet. "Move your asses. We're bugging out. Elias, get on the horn. I want every human survivor in this sector moving toward the archive entrance. We're opening the doors to everyone." "Everyone, sir?" Elias asked, still looking at the weeping warrior. "Everyone," Kaelen confirmed. "No sides, no colors, just breathers. Move." The next 4 hours were a descent into a specific kind of hell. Kaelen led a column of nearly 300 survivors, half human, half Ossic, through the shattered arteries of Kizilvash. It was a pilgrimage of the damned. The humans walked in a tight, defensive knot, their eyes darting toward their former executioners. The Ossics shuffled along in a daze, their silver hair matted with dust, their hands trembling. The city itself seemed to be reacting to their presence. The ghost glass was a riot of images. Everywhere they looked, they saw reflections of the past colliding with the present. A human woman in the glass would reach out toward a passing Ossic warrior, her shimmering hand overlapping with his scarred armor. The voices of the dead mixed with the sobs of the living. "Major, we've got a problem," Elias radioed from the front of the column. "We've reached the northern bridge, but we've got a human barricade on the other side. It's the 7th Frontier Regiment. They've got heavy walkers and they're looking for a fight." Kaelen pushed his way to the front. Across the bridge, he could see the orange glow of human floodlights. 2 manticore walkers stood like iron giants, their twin cannons leveled at the bridge. Colonel Graves, a man Kaelen had served under for 10 years, was standing on the hood of a command jeep, a megaphone in his hand. "Attention all units!" Graves's voice boomed across the chasm. "This is a restricted zone. Any Ossic movement within 500 meters will be met with lethal force. Major Vance, I know you're in there. Step away from the targets and identify yourself." Kaelen stepped onto the bridge, his hands raised, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "Colonel, it's Vance. Hold your fire. These are civilians. The war is over, sir. The broadcast. You saw it." "The broadcast was an alien trick, Vance," Graves shouted back, his voice thick with a decade of accumulated hatred. "A virus designed to lower our guard. Look at them. They're not civilians, they're combatants in a state of tactical retreat. Now step aside, Major. That's an order. We're going to clean this bridge and end this nightmare once and for all." Kaelen looked back at the column. He saw Saren, the young Ossic warrior he had rescued in the hub. The boy, and he was just a boy, was holding the hand of a human child who had been separated from her parents. They were both shaking, both staring at the muzzles of the human cannons. The humanistic theme Kaelen had carried like a secret was no longer a philosophical debate. It was a physical barrier. It was the space between a trigger and a heartbeat. "I can't do that, Colonel," Kaelen yelled, his voice echoing off the glass spires. "If you fire on them, you fire on me. I'm staying right here." "You're choosing the shards over your own kind, Kaelen?" Graves' voice was cold, disappointed. "After everything they took from us? After they burned your home? You're going to die for a monster?" "They're not monsters," Kaelen roared. "We were the ones who built the cages, Colonel. We built the dampers. We turned them into this. If we kill them now, we're just finishing what Valeria started. We're killing the only chance we have at being something better than killers." The silence that followed was broken only by the hum of the manticore walkers. Kaelen stood alone on the bridge, a solitary figure between 2 worlds that had spent a lifetime trying to annihilate one another. Suddenly, the ghost glass of the bridge began to glow. A pillar of violet light rose into the sky, and the image of Vexen appeared, 10 meters tall, her form shimmering with the brilliance of 1,000 memories. "Look," she whispered, her voice amplified by the city itself. The glass of the bridge transformed. It became a mirror, but instead of reflecting the soldiers and the walkers, it showed the memories of the people standing there. It showed Colonel Graves as a young man, holding his newborn son. It showed the Ossic warrior, Saren, as a child, being taken from his mother by the Iron Talon. It showed the shared pain, the shared loss, and the shared capacity for something other than hate. The images were so vivid, so raw, that the soldiers on the other side of the bridge began to lower their weapons. They weren't seeing an enemy. They were seeing themselves in the faces of the people they were about to slaughter. "Major," Vexen's voice echoed in Kaelen's head, "the hive pulse is arriving. 3 minutes. You must move." Kaelen looked at Graves. The colonel was staring at the image of his son in the glass, his eyes wet, his resolve crumbling. "Colonel, please," Kaelen said softly, "let us through. Give us the archive. Let us find a way to live." Graves looked at Kaelen, then at the Manticore pilots. He took a long, shuddering breath and lowered the megaphone. "All units, stand down. Open the perimeter. Let them through." The tension broke like a fever. The column began to move, humans and Ossic walking side by side past the silent iron giants of the 7th Regiment. As Kaelen passed Graves, the 2 men exchanged a look that contained a lifetime of unspoken grief. There was no victory here, only a fragile, terrifying hope. As they reached the entrance to the archive, a massive shadow fell over the city. A hive ship, 5 kilometers of black, jagged metal, descended through the clouds, its underbelly glowing with the red heat of an impending thermal purge. "They're here," Elias whispered, looking at the sky. "Get everyone inside," Kaelen yelled. "Seal the doors. We're going deep." He was the last one in. As the massive lead doors of the archive began to slide shut, Kaelen looked back at the city. Vexen's image was still there, standing on the bridge, her hand raised in a final gesture of farewell. "Vexen," he cried out. "I will hold the memory, Kaelen," she whispered as the doors closed, plunging the world into darkness. "I will be the symphony in the silence. Live, for both of us." The ground shook as the first hive pulse hit the city, but deep beneath the earth, in the heart of the archive, the light stayed on. The war was far from over, but for the first time in 30 years, the silence was filled with the sound of people breathing. And in that simple, rhythmic sound, Kaelen Vance found the only victory that ever mattered. 6 days had passed since the hive ship had scorched the surface of Ethelgard. In the subterranean depths of the archive, time had become a fluid concept, measured only by the dimming of emergency power cells and the rationed sips of recycled water. Major Kaelen Vance sat in the central command hub, his eyes fixed on a wall of flickering monitors. The awakened Ossic and the human survivors had formed a tentative, fragile society, a Deep Six colony, as the soldiers called it. The transformation was painful. For the Ossic, it was a constant battle against the phantom damper, the psychological urge to revert to cold, unfeeling logic when the weight of their new emotions became too much to bear. For the humans, it was the struggle to reconcile the face of the monster with the individual now sitting across from them, sharing a thermal blanket and a bowl of synthetic mush. "Major," a voice said from the shadows. Kaelen turned. It was Saren. The young warrior's armor had been stripped away, leaving him in a simple human flight suit that was several sizes too large. His silver hair had been trimmed, and his violet eyes were clear, though haunted. "Sit rep, Saren?" Kaelen asked, using the military slang for a situation report. "The atmospheric scrubbers in Level 4 are failing," Saren said, his voice hesitant but steady. "The silicate dust from the surface is leaking into the vents. If we do not bypass the secondary filters, we will be breathing glass within 12 hours. Can you fix it?" I have the technical knowledge," Saren said, looking at his hands. "But the crawl space is narrow. It requires 2 people to hold the pressure seals. The humans in engineering, they do not trust me to hold the line." Kaelen stood up, his joints popping. "Then I'll go with you. If they see us working together, maybe they'll stop looking for an excuse to start a riot." As they walked through the crowded corridors, Kaelen saw the cost of the fog of peace. There were nearly 400 people packed into a space designed for 200. Arguments broke out over the smallest things: a misplaced tool, a loud cough, a lingering look. The air was thick with a tension that felt like a coiled spring. "They hate us," Saren whispered as they passed a group of human refugees who spat on the floor as they walked by. "Even after what the major said on the bridge, even after the broadcast, they see the scales, not the soul." "It takes time to unlearn a lifetime of hate, Saren," Kaelen said, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder. "You killed their friends. They killed yours. That kind of debt doesn't get wiped clean with a single speech. You have to earn it, one breath at a time." They reached the engineering bay, a cavernous room filled with the hum of ancient turbines. A group of human engineers, led by a hard-bitten sergeant named Miller, were gathered around a leaking pipe. When they saw Kaelen and Saren, the room went quiet. "Major," Miller said, his hand resting on a heavy industrial wrench, "what's the Shard doing here? We've got enough problems without an alien mucking about in our vents." "Saren is here to fix the scrubbers, Miller," Kaelen said, his voice calm but firm. "He knows the Ossic filtration tech better than any of us. He's going in." "The hell he is!" Miller stepped forward, his face flushed. "My brother died in the siege of New Terra. A Talon unit burned his lungs out with a thermal purge. I'm not letting one of those things touch our air supply." "He's not a Talon anymore, Miller," Kaelen snapped, stepping between them. "He's a survivor, just like you. Now you can either let him help, or we can all sit here and wait for our lungs to crystallize. Which is it? Miller looked at Saren, his eyes burning with a decade of resentment. Saren didn't flinch. He didn't hiss or bare his teeth. He simply stood there, his head bowed, his hands open. I am sorry for your brother, Saren said softly. I cannot bring him back, but I can make sure you do not follow him. The silence in the room stretched until it felt like it would snap. Finally, Miller spat on the floor and stepped aside. Fine, but if he slips, if he even looks like he's sabotaging the seal, I'll take his head off myself. Understand? Understood, Kaelen said. The repair was a grueling, 2-hour ordeal in a space barely 40 centimeters wide. Kaelen and Saren worked in tandem, their bodies pressed together in the cramped, hot vent. Saren's movements were precise, his long, delicate fingers weaving through the complex circuitry of the scrubbers, while Kaelen held the heavy lead shielding in place. Almost there, Saren gasped, his skin glowing with a faint, frantic violet light as he exerted himself. The seal is bypassing. Suddenly, a pipe above them groaned and ruptured, spraying superheated steam into the crawl space. Kaelen roared in pain as the steam scalded his arm, but he didn't let go of the shield. If he dropped it, the radiation from the secondary core would flood the engineering bay. Kaelen! Saren cried out. Fix it! Kaelen yelled through gritted teeth. Ignore the steam. Just fix the damn seal. Saren didn't hesitate. He reached through the cloud of scalding vapor, his own skin blistering, and jammed the final bypass into place. The turbines let out a high-pitched whine, then settled into a steady, rhythmic thrum. The air in the vent began to clear. They tumbled out of the hatch, covered in soot, steam burns, and sweat. Miller and the other engineers rushed forward. They didn't go to Kaelen first. They went to the vent, checking the gauges. He did it, one of the engineers whispered. The levels are dropping. We've got air. Miller looked at Saren, who was slumped against the wall, his hands raw and peeling. The sergeant looked at the boy's injuries, then at his own wrench. He didn't apologize. That was too much to ask. But he reached out and offered Saren a canteen of water. Drink up, kid, Miller said gruffly. You earned it. It was a small victory, a tiny crack in the wall of prejudice. But as Kaelen watched the two of them, he felt a surge of hope. This was the work. It wasn't about grand treaties or orbital broadcasts. It was about the slow, painful process of proving one's humanity through sacrifice. But the peace was shattered by a sudden, violent tremor that shook the entire archive. The monitors in the command hub turned red. Major, we've got a breach. Elias's voice crackled over the comms. It's not the hive. It's the human high command. They've dropped a bunker buster on the archive entrance. They're coming in, and they're not here to talk. Kaelen ran to the monitors. Through the external cameras, he saw a fleet of human dropships landing on the scorched surface. They were marked with the seal of the Central Command, the hardliners who had stayed in orbit during the broadcast. They're here to secure the data, Kaelen said, his heart sinking, and to eliminate the corrupted units. To them, this colony is just a security risk. We have to fight, Saren said, his voice gaining a new hard edge. No, Kaelen said, turning to the boy. If we fight, we prove them right. We show them that we're still just two armies killing each other. We have to do something else. Like what? We have to show them the symphony, Kaelen said, looking at the ghost glass pillar in the center of the room. Vexen, are you there? The glass flared. I am here, Kaelen. The city's network is fragile, but I can still project. Can you show them what's happening down here? Kaelen asked. Not just the data, but the people? Can you broadcast the heart of this place to the ships in orbit? It will require every remaining watt of power in the archive. Vexen's voice whispered. It will be my final act. Once the signal is sent, the ghost glass will shatter. The city will go dark forever. Kaelen looked at the people around him, the human engineers, the Ossic warriors, the refugees. They were all looking at him, waiting for a decision. Do it, Kaelen said. The breach team, led by a colonel he didn't know, burst into the command hub 5 minutes later. They were armored to the teeth, their rifles leveled at everything that moved. Drop the weapons, the colonel roared. Secure the shards. Anyone who resists is to be executed as a collaborator. Kaelen stood in the center of the room, his hands empty. He wasn't looking at the soldiers. He was looking at the monitors. Suddenly, every screen on every human ship in orbit, every visor on every soldier in the room, and every broadcast station in the star system was filled with images. It wasn't a tactical report. It was a montage of life in the archive. They saw Miller giving Saren the canteen. They saw the human child sleeping in the arms of an Ossic warrior. They saw the shared pain of the steam burns and the shared relief of the clean air. They saw the individuals behind the labels, and they heard the music. The Ghost Glass Symphony, a haunting, beautiful melody composed of 30 years of lost memories, finally released. The soldiers in the room froze. Their rifles dipped. The colonel, a man who had spent his entire life preparing for this moment of victory, stood paralyzed by the sheer, overwhelming humanity of the broadcast. "What is this?" the colonel whispered, his voice trembling. "It's the truth, Colonel," Kaelen said, stepping forward. "It's the end of the war. Not because we won, but because we finally realized we were fighting ourselves." Outside, the city of Kazil Vosh began to glow with a brilliant, blinding light. The ghost glass was vibrating at its final frequency, releasing every last memory it held into the atmosphere. For one beautiful, impossible moment, the city was reborn in a fire of violet and amber. Then, with a sound like a billion bells ringing at once, the glass shattered. The light faded. The monitors went dark. The silence returned. Vexen was gone. The city was a pile of inert sand. The hive ships, unable to maintain their link to the corrupted planet, began to retreat into the void. In the command hub, the human soldiers slowly retracted their visors. They looked at the Ossic, and the Ossic looked back. There were no orders. There were no protocols. "Major Vance," the colonel said, his voice hollow. "What happens now?" Kaelen looked at Saren, then at Miller, then at the empty spot where the ghost glass pillar had been. He felt a deep, profound sadness, but he also felt the weight on his chest finally lift. "Now," Kaelen said, his voice clear and steady, "we go to work. We've got a planet to rebuild, and this time, we're going to do it right." He walked out of the room, heading toward the surface. He didn't need a rifle. He didn't need a plan. He just needed to see the stars one more time, and to tell the world that the monsters were finally gone, and only the people remained. The transformation was beginning. It was painful, it was messy, and it would take generations to complete. But as Kaelen stepped out onto the scorched earth of Ethelgard and saw a human soldier helping an Ossic warrior climb out of a crater, he knew that the symphony hadn't ended. It was just starting its second movement. The silence that followed the shattering of the ghost glass was a physical thing, a heavy, suffocating blanket of dust and dead echoes. When the final violet shimmer of Vexen's sacrifice faded into the gray morning, the planet of Ethelgard seemed to lose its heartbeat. The city of Kazil Vosh, once a shimmering labyrinth of memories, was now nothing more than a vast, jagged skeleton of silicate sand and rusted iron. Major Kaelen Vance stood on the observation deck of the broadcast spire, his hands gripping the railing so hard the metal groaned. His lungs burned with the fine dust of the pulverized glass, the literal remains of 1,000 years of history, and the woman who had saved his soul. He didn't move for a long time. He watched the white dust settle over the ruins like a funeral shroud. "Major," Elias's voice crackled over the local comms, stripped of its usual military bravado. "The colonel is asking for you. The brass in orbit, they're confused, sir. Half the fleet is refusing to fire, and the other half is arguing about whether to glass the whole sector from a distance. We need you down here." Kaelen didn't answer immediately. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, cracked fragment of the mirror he had given Vexen. It was just a piece of glass now, no longer vibrating with her resonance, no longer glowing with the violet light of her eyes. He felt a hole in his chest that no medical foam could ever seal, a vacuum where the war used to be. "I'm coming down, Elias," Kaelen finally said, his voice a dry rasp. "Tell the colonel to keep his shirt on, and tell the grunts to keep their fingers off the triggers. If one kinetic slug flies today, the whole piece is foobar." The descent was a slow walk through a gallery of ghosts. As Kaelen reached the transit hub, he saw the immediate aftermath of the Great Awakening. It was a scene of profound, agonizing vulnerability. The Ossic warriors, The iron-hearted killers who had haunted human nightmares for 30 years were scattered across the floor like broken dolls. Some were being tended to by human medics who worked with a hesitant, fearful precision. Others were being guarded by human soldiers who didn't know whether to point their rifles or offer their canteens. The air was thick with the sound of human crying and Ossic keening, a high-pitched rhythmic sound of mourning that Vexen had once told him was the sound of a fractured soul trying to mend itself. "Major Vance," Colonel Graves called out, walking toward him. The older man looked like he had aged 10 years in a single night. His uniform was covered in silicate dust and his eyes were bloodshot. "The archive doors are open. We've established a perimeter, but the situation is precarious. My men are asking why we're playing nursemaid to the things that wiped out the 4th Battalion." Kaelen stopped in front of the colonel, his posture stiff but no longer aggressive. "They're not things, Colonel. They're victims of the same lie we were. You saw the data. Project Sentinel wasn't an alien invasion. It was a human betrayal. We're not nursemaiding the enemy. We're helping the people we broke." Graves sighed, looking at a young Ossic warrior who was staring at a piece of cloth with a look of absolute wonder. "I see it, Kaelen. I really do. But seeing it and living it are two different animals. There are 3,000 human soldiers on this surface who have lost brothers, sisters, and children to those people. You can't expect them to just shake hands and forget." "I don't expect them to forget," Kaelen said, his gaze moving to Miller, the engineer, who was currently helping Saren bandage his steam-burned hands. Miller wasn't smiling, and he wasn't talking, but he was holding the bandage steady. "I expect them to realize that the person across from them is carrying the same weight. If we don't start processing this now, we're just waiting for the next war to start in 20 years. The first week of the wake was the hardest. Kaelen spent every waking hour as a mediator, a human bridge between two species that were terrified of one another. He broke up a dozen fights in the mess hall, most of them started by human soldiers looking for a target for their grief. He stood between a vengeful sergeant and a group of unarmed Ossic initiates, refusing to move even when a pistol was pressed against his chest. "You want to kill them, Sergeant?" Kaelen had said, his voice steady as a mountain. "You'll have to go through me. And then you'll have to explain to your kids why you killed the only people who can tell us how to stop the hive from coming back. Because the hive is still out there, and they don't care about your revenge. They only care about the silence." The sergeant had eventually backed down, his face a mask of shame and fury, but the seed of doubt had been planted. As the days turned into a month, the Deep Six colony began to change. The archive became a center of translation and shared history. The human linguists and the unbound Ossic worked 18 hours a day, deciphering the files of Project Sentinel and building a new vocabulary for a peace that had no precedent. Secondary characters, once defined by their roles in the war, began to reveal their true faces. Elias, the young corporal, discovered a talent for organizing the logistics of the shared camp, treating the Ossic rations with the same priority as the human supplies. Miller, the engineer, found that the Ossic's understanding of biomechanics was the only thing that could keep the archive's failing life support systems running. "They're efficient. I'll give them that," Miller told Kaelen one evening as they shared a cup of recycled coffee. "But they've got no sense of humor. I told Saren a joke about a wrench and a robot, and he spent 20 minutes explaining the physics of why the wrench wouldn't actually fit. It's like talking to a very sad computer." "He's learning, Miller," Kaelen said, watching Saren across the room. The Ossic boy was sitting with a group of human children, showing them how to make patterns in the silicate dust. "He's been a weapon his whole life. He's just now figuring out how to be a person. Give him another month. He'll be telling you your jokes are terrible." "They are terrible," Miller grinned. Then his face went somber. "Major, do you think she's still in there? In the glass?" Kaelen looked at the blackened remains of the central spire. "Vexen said she would be the symphony in the silence. I think she's everywhere. Every time a human and an Ossic decide not to kill each other, that's her. Every time we choose to see a face instead of a target, that's her voice." He stood up, his bones aching with a fatigue that was no longer just physical. He was processing the lesson he had learned in the ruins, the lesson that had cost Vexen her life. It wasn't just about the danger of prejudice. It was about the courage required to be soft in a world that demanded you be hard. "The war is over, Miller," Kaelen said, looking toward the elevator shaft that led to the surface. "But the peace is going to be the hardest thing we've ever done." 2 years had passed since the day the ghost glass shattered. The settlement of Vexen's Reach had grown from a desperate bunker into a thriving community of nearly 5,000 residents. It was built into the side of a mountain, overlooking the vast, white desert that had once been the city of Kizilvosh. The architecture was a strange, beautiful hybrid of human carbon fiber and ossic bioresin, a testament to the fact that two different worlds could indeed share a foundation. Kaelen Vance was no longer a major. He had resigned his commission 6 months after the awakening, much to the chagrin of the High Command. He was now the Chief of Mediation for the Reach, a fancy title for a man who spent his days ensuring that the shared history of Ethelgard didn't repeat its mistakes. On this morning, the sky was a clear, brilliant blue, a color that hadn't been seen through the silicate mist for half a century. Kaelen was standing in the center of the new Peace Plaza, watching as a group of workers, 4 humans and 4 Ossic, lowered the final piece of a commemorative monument into place. The monument was not a statue of a general or a soldier. It was a simple, massive sphere of polished obsidian, surrounded by a ring of clear synthetic glass. Inside the glass, the residents of the Reach had placed small items of significance: a human wedding ring, an Ossic blade hilt, a child's toy, a data wafer. "Steady on the lift, Saren," Kaelen called out, his voice carrying through the crisp air. "You've got a 2-degree tilt on the northern axis. Don't make Miller come over there and fix it for you." Saren, now a tall, broad-shouldered young man with a permanent smile that still looked a bit awkward on his alien features, gave Kaelen a thumbs up. He adjusted the controls of his exorig with a delicate precision. "The axis is corrected, Kaelen. Miller is busy arguing with the plumbing in Sector 4. I believe he is losing." Kaelen laughed, a sound that was no longer rare for him. He walked toward the monument, his steps steady. He didn't carry a rifle anymore. He carried a small toolkit and a datapad. His transformation was visible in the way he moved. The predatory hunch of the scout had been replaced by the upright posture of a man who no longer expected to be shot in the back. As the workers finished their task, Kaelen saw a group of human soldiers, new recruits from Earth, walking through the plaza. They stopped in front of the monument, looking at the Ossic workers with a mixture of awe and suspicion. One of the recruits, a young man who couldn't have been more than 18 years old, reached for his sidearm when an Ossic worker accidentally bumped into him. Kaelen was there in 3 seconds. He didn't yell. He didn't pull his own weapon. He simply walked between them and placed a hand on the recruit's arm. "Take a breath, son," Kaelen said softly. "The air is clean today. No need to waste it on a panic pull." He got too close, sir," the recruit stammered, his hand still trembling on the holster. "They told us in training that the shards they're unpredictable." "They told you wrong," Kaelen said, his eyes meeting the recruit's. "His name is Talon. He's a father of 2, he's a hell of an architect, and he's currently trying to make sure this monument doesn't fall over. If you want to know what he's thinking, try asking him. His English is better than mine." The recruit looked at Talon, then at Kaelen. Slowly, he moved his hand away from his weapon. "Sorry, I'm still getting used to the Reach." "We all are," Kaelen said with a nod. "Just remember, every person you see here is a choice. We chose to stop killing. You get to choose to start seeing." The recruit nodded and moved on. Kaelen watched him go, then turned to look out over the white desert of Kizilvosh. The wind was blowing, picking up the fine silicate sand and swirling it into beautiful temporary shapes. For a moment, it looked like the ghost glass was returning. Kaelen walked to the edge of the plaza and sat on a stone bench. He pulled out the cracked mirror fragment, which he now kept in a small, velvet-lined box. He looked at his reflection. He was 50 years old now. His hair was gray, and the scar on his jaw had faded into a silver line. He looked back on the 40 years he had spent in the dark, and the 2 years he had spent in the light. "I spent the better part of 4 decades looking through the scope of a long-range recon rifle. From that distance, the world is very simple. There are targets and there are teammates. There is the mission and there is the noise. I was good at the mission because I was excellent at ignoring the noise. I thought the noise was weakness. I thought the human parts of us, The fear, the love, the hesitation were just bugs in the system that needed to be patched out with discipline and lead. I was wrong. I was so profoundly, dangerously wrong. It took an enemy to show me what it meant to be a man. It took a woman with silver hair and violet eyes, a woman designed to be a weapon of the apocalypse, to teach me that the only thing that actually matters is the thing that serves no tactical purpose. Beauty, mercy, the way a hand feels when it's not holding a trigger. I used to think that survival was the highest goal, but survival is just the floor. If you stay on the floor, you're just a creature waiting for the lights to go out. To live, truly live, you have to be willing to break your own armor. You have to be willing to look at the monster across the field and realize that he's crying for the same reason you are. We spent 30 years trying to win a war, only to find out that the only way to win was to stop playing. Vexen is gone, but the symphony she started is still playing in the wind. I hear it every time a human and an Ossig share a meal. I hear it every time a child asks why we ever fought at all. I am no longer a major. I am no longer a scout. I am just a man who is grateful to be breathing in a world where a whisper of beauty is stronger than 1,000 orbital strikes. Kaelen closed the box and looked up. The sun was setting, painting the white sand in shades of orange and deep violet. He saw Saren and Miller walking toward him, arguing about something, probably the plumbing again. He saw the human recruits talking to Talon. He saw the world he had helped build, a fragile, beautiful, impossible thing. I wonder, Kaelen said to the empty air, how many walls are you still carrying in your own mind? How many people have you turned into targets because it was easier than looking them in the eye? I spent a lifetime hiding behind a scope, only to find that the most dangerous thing I ever did was say, "You're beautiful," to the enemy. What is the one word you're too afraid to say to the person you've decided to hate? He stood up and began to walk toward his friends, his shadow stretching long and steady across the Peace Plaza. Kaelen Vance reached down and picked up a handful of the white sand, letting it slip through his fingers like water. He didn't look back at the ruins. He looked forward, toward the lights of the city that were just beginning to blink on in the gathering dark.